Swing low, sweet Cadillac, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet Cadillac, coming for to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. Oh, an Eldorado coming after me, coming for to carry me home.
And good afternoon. This is Joni Eisenberg, usually heard on Monday mornings, but it's Tuesday evening. And we are doing a special show today in honor of the 70th anniversary of the Montgomery bus boycott. 2 hours, so stay tuned with us from 5 to 7 p.m. We're going to be talking about quite a number of things. And of course, it's our pledge time. This is our pledge week. We have a goal for each hour of $500, and I'm thankful to have Sataria Joyner will be helping me out with that. But you can be one of the first ones to make a pledge for this show by calling 202-588-9739 or going to the website, WPFWFM.org, and we'll be sharing other ways you can make that pledge as well. In a moment, I'm going to introduce our first guest, which I'm very happy to have on with us, Dr. Gerald Horne. But before I introduce Gerald, I wanted to welcome someone who is assisting me today, who is very much a part of the WPFW family. She serves on the station board and much, much more. And I'm going to ask Mariah to briefly introduce herself. She's been helping me with this program, and she's been helping the station a great deal. So welcome, Mariah.
Thank you, Joni, and thank you so much for having me. I was excited about this opportunity. I am a communications leader with 9 years of experience working with state-level, national, international nonprofits and labor unions. Currently serving as the project director of Unerased Black Women Speak. So I'm very excited to, in particular, speak to some of the women that were a part of this movement. But I, like you said, have some governance experience as right now, I think at the youngest WPFW local station board.
Yes. Yes.
So glad to be here.
And we're glad to have your help. And we definitely, when we talk about this bus boycott, it's very important to have people from different generations discussing this and other issues. With that said, I am honored and pleased to introduce Dr. Gerald Horne. For those of you who listen to WPFW, he certainly is no stranger. He can be heard most Fridays with Esther at 10 a.m. on the ground. But of course, Dr. Horne is a historian and author and a professor with John and Rebecca Moore's, well, he's the John and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and Africana Studies at the University of Houston. He's author of more than 40 books, and we are honored to have him on today to give a very special, some special insights to the Montgomery bus boycott and what was actually happening before the boycott started in the United States and around the world that actually influenced the outcome of the boycott. So I'm going to let Dr. Horne discuss it much better than I can. So welcome, Gerald.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for accepting the offer. So let's jump right in. As many of us know, it's now been 70 years since the Montgomery bus boycott. We're going to be talking about it for certainly through the second hour and some of the rest of this hour. But you have a particular analysis that is important for people to hear.
Well, the analysis goes like this. All praise is due, needless to say, to Rosa Parks, Dr. King, Joanne Robinson, and the other heroes and heroines of the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. However, it's important to place it in a wider context. We should not walk away with the impression that before Rosa Parks, there were no attempts to evade and avoid segregated, insulting Jim Crow travel. Some in your audience may be familiar with Lizzie Jennings in 1854, a school teacher in New York who was forcibly removed from a segregated streetcar, sued the company and won. Ida B. Wells of Mississippi and Memphis, who was thrown off a first-class train car in Tennessee and sued and won. Of course, there was the Nashville streetcar boycott of 1905, successful after 2 years. Montgomery bus boycott again, 1900 to 1902. Before Montgomery 1955, there was Baton Rouge boycott of 1953. And also, I should mention that after airplanes became civilian transportation, there were attempts to desegregate airplane travel. I talk about that in my book, Storming the Heavens, which deals with the early issue of Black Americans seeking to desegregate their airplanes and seeking to fly airplanes, for that matter. It's published by Black Classic Press of Baltimore, and you may be familiar with
absolutely.
that enterprise, headed by Paul Coates.
Paul Coates,
The former Panther, and of course, known to some as the father of the famed writer Ta-Nehisi Coates. So the question then needs to be posed, well, then what catapulted Rosa Parks into the stratosphere? And of course, you know that a few months before her heroism, there was Claudette Colvin, a teenage Black girl who also was part of this long history of resistance, but for various reasons, a movement was not built around her. Now, first of all, Rosa Parks had background in terms of organizing. Recall the Scottsboro campaign of Alabama in the 1930s, led by the left, participated in by the NAACP, an attempt to rescue 9 Black youth from the gallows and from sure execution because of false allegations of molestation of 2-year-old American women. Recall as well that there was the Southern Negro Youth Congress, which was a precursor of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which is catapulted into the scene in the 1960s, helped to produce the man we knew as Rap Brown before he passed away some days ago, not to mention Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, John Lewis, Julian Bond, etc. The Southern Negro Youth Congress, of course, incorporated Sally Davis, the mother of Angela Davis. Of course, they had roots in Birmingham, Alabama. So Alabama was fertile soil for Rosa Parks to arise. But perhaps more than that, there's the changing global correlation of forces. By 1955, the United States was involved in a Cold War and involved in contestation with the then socialist camp for hearts and minds in Africa and the Caribbean in particular. And African and Caribbean students were flooding into historically Black colleges and campuses, which they had been doing for decades, including campuses in Montgomery and Tuskegee in Alabama as well, not to mention Howard University in Washington, D.C. And the U.S. authorities were quite concerned that these future leaders would be alienated from the United States and therefore would take their valuable contacts and resources away from Washington to Moscow, for example. And that creates tremendous pressure for the U.S. authorities to put pressure on the Alabama authorities to make sure that minimally Rosa Parks is not dragged out of her house and lynched, which could have well happened in the late 19th century, for example, in terms of protests of segregated streetcar travel. And so what happens, particularly in Washington, D.C., with regard to this kind of segregation, is that the U.S. State Department suggests that Black students from overseas have lapel buttons that they could wear that would distinguish them from Black Americans so that they could go to restaurants without being molested or annoyed by the owners, for example. So this is the wider context that leads to the success of the Montgomery bus boycott. And obviously, we need to draw reasonable inferences from that success with regard to the intersection of domestic organizing and domestic militancy, along with paying attention to the global correlation of forces that we can take advantage of.
Absolutely, Gerald Horne, and of course, shedding a lot of light on this subject, which we don't often hear. I want to ask you to go back for a minute to the Scottsboro boys. Of course, a lot of young people listening right now, I'm sure, don't really know about the Scottsboro boys. When I was growing up in New York City, it was a lot of people. Well, of course, my parents or my grandparents talked a lot about the Scottsboro boys. There were even songs sung about them. So just share a little bit more about that story, Dr. Horne.
Well, the case of the Scottsboro Nine was exceedingly important and profound. It was akin to the anti-apartheid movement, which coursed through the United States and worldwide in the 1970s and 1980s, culminating in South African independence in 1994. In other words, the international community, led not least by the socialist camp, particularly the Soviet Union and communist parties worldwide, took up this case of these 9 Black youth and helped to rescue them from sure execution and the gallows. Mm-hmm. And it led to important Supreme Court decisions, which are still in existence, which help to protect the rights of criminal defendants to this very day. And the NAACP, it should also be added, was a participant in this domestic defense, although for various reasons they did not have the international connections, which ultimately were the major reason why the Scottsboro Nine were not executed. And it's important to note as well that subsequently, I mentioned Angela Davis, for example, who's still in the land of the living, the professor who was charged with capital crimes in Northern California in the 1970s. An international campaign intervened on her behalf as well, which helped to rescue her from what appeared to be certain execution. And so you may detect a theme here, which is militancy and organizing domestically, and how that is coordinated with comrades and friends overseas.
Overseas, yes. And Mariah, I'm going to ask you if you have a question for Dr. Horne, please feel free to jump right in. And talk to us a little bit more about those earlier days of Rosa Parks that many, of course, people know that she sat down on that bus. But as you alluded to, she did a lot of study and organizing, and we'll be hearing more in the second hour about who she worked with, E.D. Nixon, who was actually very much involved with the sleeping car porters and the labor movement. But tell us a little more about the Rosa Parks that many people may not know about.
Well, as you know, after being catapulted into prominence and success of a sort, she wound up spending her latter days in Detroit, Michigan. She worked very closely with the late founder of the Congressional Black Caucus, speaking of John Conyers. You may recall as well that she coordinated and worked with Robert F. Williams. Recall that in North Carolina in the 1950s, he was accused similarly of false charges, fled to socialist Cuba, where he helped to set up Radio Free Dixie, which broadcasts messages into the South that were adjudged to be seditious by the U.S. authorities, eventually wound up in China in the 1960s during the height of the Cultural Revolution, then, of course, moved back and returned to Michigan, where he was able to evade and avoid being extradited back to the Tar Heel State. And many are surprised, I'm afraid to say, by the fact that Rosa Parks was in strict solidarity with Robert F. Williams, who in the estimates of many, was considered to be a kind of moving spirit of the so-called Black Power movement, which obviously arises in its most militant phase in the 1960s. And so Rosa Parks' life of struggle leaves us with many lessons that we can learn from if we pay attention.
Yes, and perhaps you can share some of those lessons and go back a little further earlier before she was known. She and I believe with Dr. King went to a special school in the South that taught a lot about progressive history.
Well, one of the unfortunately kept secrets of the anti-Jim Crow movement is the role of the left. It's interesting. Many liberals, of course, were anti-communists, were anti-socialists, for example. Many liberals tried to portray themselves as being the moving spirit behind Dr. King and behind Rosa Parks. You're referring to the Highlander Folk School in Tennessee. And of course, throughout the South during this period, there were billboards that were placed along highways showing Dr. King in particular alongside various radicals. This was meant to discredit him. You may recall as well that a close advisor of Dr. King was a former board chair of Pacifica, speaking of the late
Yes.
Jack Odell, a background in the trade union movement, the National Maritime Union, to be more specific. And he chaired the Pacifica board for a number of years. It was John F. Kennedy, the US president, who took Dr. King into the Rose Garden of the White House to evade the monitoring devices by the pugnacious leader of the FBI at that time, speaking of J. Edgar Hoover, because he wanted to advise and counsel Dr. King to get rid of Jack Odell.
Mm-hmm.
And Dr. King said that he would, but then maintained underground and subterranean contact with Jack Odell, which then was captured on tape by the FBI, leading J. Edgar Hoover to claim, among other things, that Dr. King was a, quote, notorious liar, unquote. And Rosa Parks as well was caught up in this controversy, given the fact that she was linked, needless to say, rather closely to Martin Luther King. And the attempt to red bait the anti-Jim Crow movement and to discredit it by suggesting that it was communist dominated, communist influenced, was one of the oldest tricks of our antagonists. Fortunately, I would like to think and I would like to say that that trick has lost its potency. I witnessed the election in New York City of Mr. Mamdani, a card-carrying member of the Democratic Socialists of America. And so perhaps we are in a new era that will open new vistas and horizons that will allow us to take advantage of the many lessons that Rosa Parks has bequeathed to us.
Absolutely. And in a minute, we're going to take a little pitch break, but perhaps share with our listeners a little more about that Highlander school that Rosa Parks and Dr. King went to. And I understand that there were that school as well was threatened by the right wing.
It certainly was. And by the way, speaking of Tennessee, one of the leaders, a young girl at the time in the 1950s, this is before the Little Rock High School, Central High School in Little Rock was desegregated in 1957. Before that, in Clinton, Tennessee, there was desegregation. And interestingly enough, that high school eventually was bombed by the Ku Klux Klan and destroyed. And I think sometimes we lose sight of the staunch and stiff opposition to desegregation. Now it's seen by some as something that the nation should be proud of, and you get the idea that it was welcomed with little dissent. But that's not the case. There were federal troops that were sent to Little Rock, Arkansas, for example, to keep these 9 Black youth desegregating Central High School from being mauled. Recall what happened in Oxford, Mississippi, 1962, when there were killings, when James Meredith sought to desegregate the campus of Ole Miss. Once again, federal troops had to be deployed there to show you that it was not sectional or geographical. Recall the Boston busing crisis of the 1970s. Once again, involving attacks on Black children, who I'm afraid to say were in the vanguard of this struggle against U.S. apartheid. And of course, in Yonkers, New York in the 1980s, you had a similar crisis over housing desegregation, which, by the way, is represented in a docudrama your listeners may want to pay attention to called Show Me a Hero, which I highly recommend. And so this was an era of tumult. These victories over apartheid came with bloodshed. They did not come easily. And understandably, we are marking and celebrating the heroic role of one Rosa Parks, who in many ways helped to kick off this new era.
That's correct, with the help of many others. Again, you're listening to Dr. Gerald Horne. This is me, Joni, usually heard Monday mornings, but it's Tuesday afternoon, and we're in the middle of our end of the year pledge drive for this week. And this hour, I believe, or these 2 hours have a goal of $1,000. That's $500 an hour. And I have Sataria Joyner, who's going to help me out. We know that there are many listening who can afford, some people, of course, can't, but can afford to make a pledge. We definitely need it. We fell a little bit behind during the fall pledge drive, so we're trying to make up for it right now. You can call 202-588-9739 or go onto the website, WPFWFM.org. And hello, Sataria.
Hi, Joni. Thanks for having me this evening.
It's great to have you.
I've very much been enjoying this information. First of all, I want the audience to recognize, Joni Eisenberg does her program and she does these specials as a volunteer to WPFW.
Yes,
and has put together quality shows, week after week for years because of not only her love of the information, but her love of sharing that information with all of us. And if you can, I know you appreciate it, not if, because you appreciate it, we ask that you make a donation, not only to WPFW, not only to our love and appreciation of Joni Eisenberg, but for this information, because WPFW is a free education we all have access to, and we want to keep it going. We want to make sure that WPFW is around for generations to come. Give us a call, make your donation, 202-588-9739, or go to our website, click donate now at WPFWFM.org. We know that times are tough. That's why we ask, if you can, to consider becoming a sustainer. You can become a sustainer for as little as $10 a month. And that $10 a month, it adds up to $120 a year. If you can do 30 a month, 50, 1,000, we ask you to do that as well. But you can do it for as little as $10 a month. And it may seem like a small amount, but at WPFW, that makes a huge difference. It allows us to plan and budget for the future and to continue to grow. So like I said, we know times are hard, but so we'd like to have the Sustainer program in there to make sure that if you want to participate financially with your public radio station, you can.
Absolutely. And Sataria, tell folks how they could do that Cash App.
Now they can do Cash App by going to Cash App. It's $WPFWFM. That's how you can donate to WPFW through Cash App. $WPFWFM. We got so many ways for people to donate because we want to make it as easy as possible. So you can also text to donate. You can text the letters WPFWFM to the number 801-801 and donate that way.
Absolutely. And of course, we'd love to have some new members as well as members who've been with us for many, many years. But we definitely would love to have some new members as well. This is the end of the year. And of course, one thing that some of us are always thinking about, I wish we could give each of those staff members, including the one who's talking with us right now, a big raise. So if you think that the workers at WPFW should be, if we had the money to give them a raise, it would be a great thing. So make a pledge in honor of the actual workers at the station. That we only have how many, 5 or 6 Satoria paid people now.
Right. It's only a handful of us that are there, and even smaller number of us who are full time. I think people are often, when they come in and they meet the staff, are often amazed that, people are doing so much with so little. But it is largely because of people like you, Joni, folks who dedicate and volunteer their time, their knowledge, their passion, their connections to help WPFW, and by helping WPFW also help our broader community.
Absolutely. Well, you're going to join us again in a little bit, but do we have any pledges yet?
It doesn't look like we have anyone yet, but I think they've been so enthralled. They haven't picked up the phone yet. They've been so enthralled with the information, but they're going to call us at 202-588-9739 or click donate now at WPFWFM.org.
Okay, thank you, Satori. We'll talk to you in a few more minutes. And let's conclude our discussion with Dr. Gerald Horne. Of course, you can hear Gerald on many, many platforms, and I'm thankful that I listen to him all week long. But Gerald, what are your kind of final thoughts or closing thoughts for now about, again, some of the lessons where we are today and what's important for us now as we move into what for many of us is a frightening time. It's certainly a challenging time.
Certainly a challenging time indeed, and that underscores and underlines the absolute importance of the Pacifica Network and WPFW in particular, because this is where you tune in to get an idea of how our struggle is proceeding. And I would like to think that we may have turned the corner with regard to the fight against fascism and Trumpism. That is to say, with all of this incessant squabbling between and amongst the various factions of the Trump movement, speaking of the struggle, for example, between pro-Zionist forces and the Hitler's Cool faction led by Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson, speaking of the recent controversial interview of Chief of Staff Susie Weil, where she unveils what we always suspected, which is conflict between J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio as they line up to see who's going to succeed Mr. Trump in 2028. And this is where you tune in to get an idea of how our struggle is proceeding, whether it's time to go underground or go into exile, or time, in fact, to put your foot on the gas. And obviously, I think it's time for the latter. But where would you get that message if not for WPFW and Pacifica Radio?
Absolutely. And we're very proud and thankful that Dr. Horne is definitely part of the Pacifica Radio, not only right here in WPFW. He can be heard on WBAI. He can be heard out there on the West Coast. And you have your own show in California that can be heard Saturdays. To tell the people what
KPFK Radio in Los Angeles, Pacifica Radio in the Southland. The show is Freedom Now, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern on Saturdays. It can also be found on YouTube on the Activist News Network. And I must say that some of the interviews we do on that program are priceless. And speaking of using radio as an educational device, I can think of no better example than Pacifica Radio Los Angeles.
Interesting. Well, I listen to you sometimes on that show, but other than that, I don't usually listen to that station. But maybe we'll need to get more integrated in our Pacifica family. So I'm going to ask our engineer, because we're going to get ready for the next segment of this 2-hour special, talking about lessons of the Montgomery boycott, and not just lessons, but a lot of people do not know about the details of the organizing that took place over 381 days. They know about Rosa Parks, which is a good thing, but they don't know about the hundreds, or if not thousands, of people who were out there organizing. I don't know, Dr. Horne, if you have a good estimate of the number of people that were involved in that over those 381 days.
Hundreds, if not thousands, as you've already suggested. And keep in mind, the boycott also involved people organizing to transport those who needed a ride in private vehicles, for example. This is in the era before spreadsheets, in the era before smartphones, for example. They had to be worried about their phones being bugged. They had to worry about the civilian cars being attacked. So it was more than a notion. It was really a magnificent exercise. And our youth in particular need to be aware that they should not take for granted these issues that seem mundane. For example, like being able to ride a bus without being harassed and not being forced to give up your seat to someone who enters the bus after you, which of course was quite common during the era of Rosa Parks.
Absolutely.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.
Power to the people.